I'm a 29-year-old woman, and for most of my life, my mother made it clear that my opinions didn't matter. Karen ran our home like a boardroom. Everything needed her approval first. My dad, Mark, mostly stayed quiet. Growing up, I learned that keeping the peace meant agreeing with her, even when she was wrong. When I was younger, I wanted to be an interior designer. My mom thought that was playing with colors, not a career. She wanted me to join the family accounting firm like my cousin Beth. Beth was her example of success. Steady job, predictable life, neat little box. I was the one who wanted too much freedom. At my graduation showcase, where students presented their final design projects, my mom arrived in a tailored suit like she was attending a tax meeting. She walked through the space, looked around at the crowd admiring my work, and loudly said it was cute, like decorating for a dollhouse. Everyone heard her. I remember the polite smiles, the awkward glances. My dad coughed and stared at the floor. After that, every family gathering turned into a review session about my choices. My mother would talk over me at the dinner table, listing all the things I could have done if only I'd listened. She compared my earnings to Beth's, who worked in her office. I stayed polite. I didn't argue, but every word built a quiet wall between us. The breaking point came one evening, when she hosted a small dinner at home. It was supposed to be family night, but it turned into another lecture. She looked at me and said, "Your opinions don't matter because you don't live in the real world." I didn't raise my voice or make a scene. I just told her she was right, that from now on, she wouldn't have to hear my opinions at all. Then I stood up, grabbed my bag, and left before dessert. That week, I packed my things and moved to a small apartment in the city, an hour away. My dad called once, asking if I was sure. I said yes. After that, we didn't talk much. My mom pretended I didn't exist. I started taking freelance design work, one project at a time, until I had a small list of repeat clients. 2 years later, I owned a modest studio with 2 employees and steady business. Most of my projects were mid-range home remodels, kitchens, bathrooms, living spaces, nothing flashy but consistent. Then one morning, I got an email from a real estate developer who wanted me to handle a full redesign for several homes in my old neighborhood. It was a huge opportunity. When I looked up the addresses, one of them stopped me. It was the house directly across from my parents'. For a minute, I stared at the screen, thinking about what it would mean to go back there. The offer was too good to pass up, so I accepted. A week later, I drove down that familiar street. The same trimmed hedges, the same porch lights. My mom's car was in the driveway, gleaming like always. Across the road stood the property I'd be transforming. Worn siding, faded paint, good bones underneath it all. As I stood there with my clipboard, measuring the front steps, the curtains from my parents' house shifted. I caught a glimpse of my mother watching. She didn't wave. She just turned away like she hadn't seen me. I went back to my work and measured another corner. The air on that street felt heavier than I remembered. But this time, I wasn't the girl whose opinions didn't matter. I was the professional everyone in that neighborhood would soon be talking about. I finished my inspection, sent the first draft of plans that evening, and confirmed the renovation schedule. For the first time in years, my mother would see my work, whether she wanted to or not. The project across the street officially started on a bright Monday morning. I pulled up early with my team, 2 assistants, a contractor, and a photographer for progress documentation. The house was in rough shape, but the structure was solid. I laid out the floor plans on the hood of my car, made a quick schedule call, and got to work measuring the exterior. From across the road, the sound of a door slamming made everyone glance up. My mother stepped out, holding a mug, wearing her usual hosting a neighborhood smile. She looked directly at me, walked down her driveway, and crossed the street like she owned both properties. Without any greeting, she asked why I was showing off in front of her house. I didn't answer that. I told her I was here for my client, not for attention, and went back to marking the porch dimensions. She hovered for another minute, trying to get a reaction, then turned sharply and walked back. By that evening, the neighborhood knew I was renovating the house across from my parents. I started getting polite waves from people who used to ignore me. My client, a real estate investor named Mr. Cooper, came by to review my proposal and signed off on every design choice. He wanted the project done in 3 months. Tight but doable. 2 days later, while unloading flooring samples, I heard my mother's voice floating over the hedge. She was talking to her friend Nancy, telling her how kids these days think paint chips equal success. Nancy gave me a small, uncomfortable smile before retreating indoors. I pretended not to hear. The next week moved fast. We stripped old wallpaper, replaced worn cabinets, and opened up the living area for natural light. The transformation caught attention quickly. People walking their dogs stopped to ask who was doing the remodel. My truck had my business name on the side, and within a few days, my website visits spiked. By Friday, one of the local realtors stopped me to ask if I'd consider consulting on another property. She mentioned that word was spreading about the designer across from the Davises, my parents. That name still caught me off guard, but I just nodded and handed her my card. The following Monday, my father showed up at the site wearing his work jacket, pretending he was there to check on construction quality. He asked a few questions about materials, nodded approvingly, and before leaving, said quietly, "Your mother didn't expect you'd come this far." Then he left before I could respond. Over the next 2 weeks, the client approved every stage without changes. He was thrilled with the progress and hinted at featuring the home in a local magazine once it was done. My assistants and I worked late most nights, painting trim, sourcing fixtures, and arranging deliveries. Meanwhile, across the street, my mother couldn't resist inserting herself again. She walked over one morning while I was finalizing lighting placements and asked why I hadn't used warmer tones. I reminded her politely that the color scheme was chosen by the homeowner. She frowned, folded her arms, and muttered that a little humility would go a long way. Later that day, one of the electricians told me she'd tried to give them alternate directions while I was out picking up supplies. He said she'd insisted she knew better because she'd remodeled her kitchen twice. I laughed it off, but from that point, I made sure she stayed out of the work zone. By mid-project, the transformation was undeniable. The once dull property now had modern windows, open floor plans, and a minimalist finish that caught every passerby's eye. Realtors began using it as a before and after reference on local listings. People from my old high school even reached out to ask if I was taking new clients. The recognition made its way back to my mother, of course. At the grocery store, she started telling people she barely knew what her daughter was doing, but that she hoped it turned out nice. That was her way of softening the blow, pretend indifference when the attention wasn't hers. The client, thrilled with the results, mentioned he'd already received interest from buyers willing to pay above listing price. He asked me to prepare photos for submission to a local design feature. While I coordinated with the magazine editor, my mother crossed the street again, acting like she was just curious. She looked around the finished living room, tracing the countertops with her hand, and said it was too modern for most families. I told her the design wasn't meant to please everyone. That conversation ended with her accusing me of arrogance. She said I'd forgotten my roots and warned that family doesn't stay patient forever. Then she left without another word. The next morning, I saw her talking to a group of neighbors near her mailbox. Their glances gave it away. They were discussing me. A few hours later, I got 2 new client inquiries from that same neighborhood. Irony had a strange sense of humor. When the project wrapped, I stood on the sidewalk across from my parents' house, reviewing final photos with my team. My mother's curtains shifted again. This time she didn't hide. She watched as a photographer captured shots of the newly renovated home that would soon be featured in print. I turned, nodded politely toward her window, and went back to work. I didn't need to say anything. Every detail of that house already said enough. About 2 months after finishing the project across the street, I got a call from my dad. His tone was calm but tired. Their kitchen had flooded from a burst pipe behind the sink, and the damage spread fast. Cabinets were warped, floors buckled, and half the drywall had to be torn out. They needed it fixed quickly because insurance only covered partial repairs if the work started within the week. When I asked if Mom was on board with me handling it, he hesitated before saying she'd rather explore other options first. That told me everything. For the next 10 days, she called around town for quotes. I knew most of the reputable contractors. Small town, small circle. Word got back to me that she'd been complaining about overpriced amateurs and that her daughter thought she was too important to help family. Eventually, she ran out of choices. Every contractor either refused to deal with her reputation for micromanaging or quoted double my rate to make it worth the headache. My dad called again, saying she was ready to talk. When she finally reached out, I kept the conversation short. I agreed to take the job under one condition: strictly business. No family discounts, full deposit upfront, and every term in writing. She tried to sound offended, but I emailed the contract within the hour. She signed the next day, probably more out of desperation than agreement. I arrived with my crew that Friday morning. The kitchen looked worse than I expected. Mold on the lower walls, ruined cabinets, and water-damaged subflooring. My mom stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, scanning every move like she was running a board meeting. I directed the team to start removing damaged sections while she muttered about people making messes to fix messes. Within a day, she was nitpicking everything. The tile samples, the paint finish, even the toolboxes being too loud. At one point, she interrupted me mid-measurement to tell the workers to reposition the fridge for better flow. I didn't argue. I just opened my binder and showed her the signed clause giving me sole creative authority during the project. The crew watched the exchange in silence. After that, they stopped taking any instruction unless it came from me. By the 3rd day, her control started slipping. She couldn't keep up with the pace or the terminology. Suppliers called me directly, invoices went through my office, and she had to ask permission to enter the workspace. I stayed polite but firm. One afternoon, a delivery driver mentioned that the address had been modified last minute for the countertop order. I checked the confirmation email. Someone had tried to reroute it to another vendor. The signature was my mother's. I called the supplier to restore the original order, then added an administrative fee per the interference clause in our contract. She didn't argue when the invoice arrived. When the new flooring came in, a few neighbors peeked through the open doorway. They complimented how modern the space looked, saying it was nothing like her old style. My mom smiled tightly, pretending she had guided the entire project. The week after, my dad stopped by while the crew was finishing backsplash installation. He watched quietly for a while, then said, "You run this place like clockwork." It wasn't dramatic, just factual. That was enough. By the end of week 4, the renovation looked incredible. Bright lighting, open layout, seamless cabinetry, and a centerpiece island that drew the eye immediately. I arranged the final inspection, cleaned up with the team, and prepared the invoice for the remaining balance. That evening, they hosted a small dinner for a few friends to celebrate the remodel. I was invited as the designer, not the daughter. I showed up briefly to check that everything functioned correctly before guests arrived. My mom wore a polished smile, introducing me with a casual "This is our contractor." Throughout the evening, people admired the transformation, complimenting every detail: the layout, the lighting, the custom shelving. She nodded along, taking partial credit without saying it outright. But the shift was obvious. When a guest asked how she came up with the design, she paused for a second too long. She didn't have an answer. My dad stepped in, saying it was entirely my plan from start to finish. The table went silent before someone changed the subject. After that, she didn't try to redirect the conversation again. When the guests left, she lingered by the sink, tracing her hand along the new quartz surface. No comments, no critique, just quiet observation. I packed my folders, left the maintenance guide on the counter, and wished them a good night. On my way out, my dad walked me to the driveway. He said softly that he wished he'd stood up for me years ago. Then he handed me a check for the full amount, including the interference fee. He didn't ask for a discount, and I didn't offer one. The next morning, I received 3 messages from neighbors asking about potential projects. They'd seen the work during the dinner and wanted something with the same finish. Word spreads fast in that town. My mother didn't reach out again after that. But a week later, I noticed she'd started keeping the blinds open during the day, letting sunlight hit the new backsplash just right. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. And that was enough for now. 3 weeks after finishing my parents' kitchen, my studio started to gain serious momentum. A real estate magazine featured one of my remodels in their Emerging Designers to Watch section. The article praised my practical, livable approach to design and included before and after photos from the house across my parents' street. It spread fast around town. A few days later, my phone buzzed nonstop with new client inquiries, mostly referrals from that same neighborhood. When I visited the hardware supplier, one of the cashiers mentioned my mom had been in earlier. She'd pointed at the magazine on the counter and said her daughter just got lucky with good photographers. That sounded about right. But luck didn't build the schedule I was keeping. Every day was booked solid. Clients from nearby towns called for consultations, and contractors started requesting partnerships. It was professional validation I'd worked years to earn. Eventually, even my mother couldn't ignore it. At a community luncheon she attended with her friends, 3 of them brought up my article. She kept her smile fixed and called it a small local thing, but the comments didn't stop there. One of them mentioned hiring me for a new project. My mother changed the subject to the weather. Later that week, my dad called about another issue at their house. Their upstairs bathroom had developed mold from a slow leak behind the shower wall. He asked if I could come by for an estimate. I told him to send photos first, and when he did, it was clear the damage was spreading. He said Mom wanted a simple update, but I knew that meant the cheapest fix possible. I sent over a proposal and a formal contract, identical to what any other client received, payment schedule, materials list, and full design authority. She hesitated for 3 days before signing. When she finally did, she wrote in the notes section, "Keep it modest." The next morning I arrived with my crew. My mother stayed nearby, arms folded, observing every movement. She tried to suggest a lighter tile and less trendy fixtures, but I reminded her that design control was part of the signed agreement. The workers followed my lead without hesitation. By the 3rd day, she stopped hovering, only appearing when neighbors walked past. She'd suddenly become proud again, waving them over to see progress. The lead contractor told her I ran one of the most organized sites he'd seen in months. Her smile faltered, then returned just as quickly. At the final walkthrough, the new bathroom gleamed, modern, minimal, everything lined up perfectly. My dad looked impressed. My mom called it functional, which, from her, was practically a compliment. She invited me to stay for dinner, and I accepted. The meal started quietly. My dad talked about the house repairs while my mom poured wine like she was trying to keep her hands busy. Halfway through, 2 neighbors passing by stopped to congratulate me through the open window. They'd seen the magazine article and wanted to know when I was free for consultations. My mom forced a tight smile, saying she'd have to check my schedule. Dinner turned tense when she mentioned that my work must be trendy right now. I shifted the conversation toward other clients until she gave up trying to minimize it. My dad, breaking years of silence, told her to stop interrupting. The room went still. She didn't speak again for the rest of the evening. Before leaving, I handed them the maintenance folder and invoice. My dad walked me out and said he was proud of what I'd built. My mom stood at the doorway, pretending to organize mail. 2 days later, the real estate magazine reposted my feature online. It reached thousands more views and even landed on a few local blogs. Several of my mom's friends tagged each other in the comments, praising that talented designer from their neighborhood. By the weekend, 3 of those same women had booked me for design consultations, one for a sunroom, another for a kitchen, and one for a full home remodel. Each mentioned hearing about my work from someone close to me. They didn't need to say who. Every booking came through formal contracts. Every project followed the same process, clear, structured, and professional. My name started circulating not just in that suburb, but 2 towns over. From then on, when my mother's friends mentioned me, she smiled and called me busy. But she stopped adding her usual disclaimers. She had to. Every compliment they gave her came from something I'd done. I didn't need to hear her admit it. The shift was already visible. When I dropped off sample binders one afternoon, she opened the door halfway, stepped aside, and let me work. No comments, no instructions, just silence. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was the first time she'd treated me like someone whose opinion actually mattered. About 4 months after finishing the bathroom remodel, my dad called again. His voice was lower than usual, and he got straight to the point. The constant house upgrades had drained their savings, and a few small renovation loans my mother had taken out were catching up fast. He said they were struggling to keep up with payments, especially after some unexpected maintenance on their second rental property. When I asked how bad it was, he admitted they'd already delayed 2 mortgage payments on that rental. My mother had kept it quiet, hoping the house would sell before the situation got worse. She'd been trying to handle it herself, staging and showing it to potential buyers, but no offers came in. Every buyer said the interior looked outdated. A week later, she called me. The tone was polite, practiced. She said she wanted a little help preparing the rental for sale, claiming it was about family pride, not money. I told her I could take the job if it went through the realtor and under a full contract. She didn't respond right away. When she finally agreed, her message came through my dad's number, attached to a scanned signature. The house itself was a small 2-bedroom, with decent bones, but decades-old finishes. I visited with the realtor, took photos, and mapped out a plan. Fresh paint, minimal furniture, natural lighting. My mom tagged along the first day, muttering that I was making it look too modern. I didn't answer. I sent her the invoice and timeline, both addressed to her and the realtor jointly. She grumbled that it felt strange being treated like a stranger, but she paid the deposit on time. For the next few days, she lingered around the site, trying to offer suggestions about curtain choices or plant placement. The crew ignored her, following my direction. Midway through the project, my dad stopped by with coffee and quietly said my mother was rattled. Apparently, she'd realized that every recent improvement to their life, the kitchen, the bathroom, now this sale, had come from my work. For someone who spent decades preaching self-reliance, that was a hard truth to swallow. One morning, while we rearranged staging furniture, I overheard her talking to a neighbor outside. She said her daughter could be cold, but she gets results. It was the closest thing to a compliment she'd ever given me. Within 3 weeks, the property looked like a different home. Clean, bright, and simple. The kind of space buyers walked into and immediately pictured living in. The realtor was thrilled. At the open house, nearly every visitor commented on the design. The first offer came the next day, above asking price. When the sale closed, my mom thanked the realtor publicly on social media, calling her a miracle worker. She didn't mention me, but she did forward me the payment receipt with the subject line, "All settled." Within days, word got around. The agent told colleagues that my staging had added nearly 15% to the final sale price. 2 new agencies reached out, offering contracts for upcoming listings. I added 3 more staging projects to my schedule that month. Meanwhile, my mom started sending quick questions through my dad, things like what wall color worked best for resale, or whether marble counters were still popular. He framed them as harmless curiosity, but it was obvious she was using him as a middleman. I kept my replies short, one-line answers, straight to the point. I didn't offer explanations or opinions, just information. That distance made it clear where things stood. By then, it had become impossible for her to deny the shift. Her friends began hiring me directly. Every design trend she tried to copy came from something I'd done first. Even the local home magazine ran another short feature on one of my remodels, listing me as a key name in suburban staging. I heard from my dad that she clipped the article and hid it in a kitchen drawer. She still refused to admit how much she relied on me, but her actions spoke louder than her words. By the end of that year, she'd sold the rental, paid off the smaller loans, and stopped bragging about handling things herself. Yet every financial or design decision that followed somehow traced back to me. When I passed by their street one evening, I saw her standing outside watching a contractor paint her front door a color I'd once used on another client's project. She didn't look up when I drove by, but she didn't need to. The message was clear enough. Every corner of her carefully controlled world was now shaped by the daughter whose opinions once didn't matter. And the more she tried to keep that truth quiet, the more obvious it became to everyone else around her. My studio had grown fast over the next few months. I'd hired another designer, brought on an assistant, and leased a bigger workspace downtown. Most of our projects came from referrals, many of them from that same circle of homeowners who once treated my mother like the local expert. Now they called me directly. One morning, while reviewing blueprints, I looked up to see her walking through the glass door of my office. She didn't have an appointment. She was dressed neatly, carrying a box of pastries like it was a peace offering. My assistant greeted her, and she introduced herself as Lily's mother with a tone that made it sound like a title. She said she was just dropping by to see how things were going. I told her I had meetings all morning and couldn't talk long. She lingered near the desk, glancing at client portfolios pinned on the wall. When she noticed the framed feature from the real estate magazine, she smiled tightly and said it must feel nice to be recognized. Before leaving, she placed the pastry box on the table and told my assistant to make sure I took a break. That afternoon, my dad called to say she'd gone home offended. She thought I'd been dismissive. I told him to remind her it was an office, not a family living room. For a few quiet weeks, things stayed normal. Then my dad called again. Their homeowner's insurance had lapsed after a missed payment, and an electrical short in the attic caused a small fire. The damage wasn't catastrophic, but the smoke and water from putting it out had ruined half the upstairs. Contractors refused to take the job after hearing how she'd interfered on past projects. My dad asked if I could at least look at the house. When I arrived, the smell of smoke still clung to the walls. The ceilings were streaked with black, insulation exposed. She stood at the top of the stairs, trying to act composed, but the stress showed. The quote she'd gotten from a local company was twice what she could afford. I did a full assessment and told them it wasn't cosmetic. It needed rewiring, new drywall, and full cleanup. I emailed a written estimate later that night. It wasn't cheap, but it was honest. The next morning, my dad responded with one line: "We'll sign if you can start next week." The contract was identical to all others: strict payment plan, material approval through me only, and no unscheduled site visits. She signed without a word. When work began, the crew tore down the damaged sections and cleared the entire floor. Neighbors passing by slowed down to watch. My company's trucks parked along the street with my logo clearly visible. Within a few days, everyone in the area knew who was handling the rebuild. My mom tried to maintain her usual composure. She offered coffee to the workers, occasionally wandered in with suggestions, but stopped when I reminded her of the contract clause. The crew respected that boundary, reporting directly to me. Week after week, the transformation became impossible to ignore. New hardwood floors, fresh walls, recessed lighting, every inch rebuilt better than before. I saw her watching from the doorway some afternoons, silently observing the order and precision she could never quite control. My dad dropped by often, sometimes bringing lunch for the team. One day, while we reviewed receipts, he told me she'd been bragging to her friends that her daughter handled every detail like a pro. He said she never mentioned how reluctant she'd been to ask in the first place. When the project finished, I did one final walkthrough. The house looked brighter, cleaner, calmer. She followed me through the rooms without saying much. When I handed her the binder with all the warranties and invoices, she hesitated before taking it, almost like it carried more weight than the paper inside. I left after that, but a few days later, I started hearing things. A neighbor emailed asking about hiring my company for her remodel. saying she'd been inspired by the work on your parents' house. Another text came from one of my mom's acquaintances, wanting help staging her own property. It was clear word had spread again. Over the next month, I saw my mother in passing a few times around town, at the grocery store, at a cafe. She always greeted me politely, no sarcasm, no backhanded tone. It was strange in its own way, too calm to be coincidence. Then my dad stopped by my office one morning. He said she'd been telling everyone how thankful she was for the rebuild, but never directly to me. He laughed a little, saying it was the closest she'd ever come to saying sorry. The irony didn't escape anyone in town. The woman who once dismissed design as decorating now lived in a home her daughter rebuilt from the ground up, and the neighbors who once humored her advice now called me instead. By the time spring came, my business had tripled. My mom's name still carried weight socially, but not the kind she used to control. When her friends talked about home design or renovations, my company came up first. She didn't correct them anymore. She sent flowers to my office once. Not a note, not an explanation, just white lilies in a glass vase. My assistant asked who they were from, and I said they were from a satisfied client. That was easier than admitting the truth, because by then, even she had started treating me like one. 6 weeks after the restoration was finished, I drove to my parents' house one last time to finalize the post-project inspection. The smell of new paint lingered faintly, the kind of scent that made a place feel brand new. Every wall, every cabinet, every inch looked different, structured, calm, intentional. My mother walked through the space slowly, fingertips brushing the edge of the new countertops. She didn't comment. She didn't need to. My dad suggested I stay for dinner since the project was officially complete. I agreed, mostly out of habit, not nostalgia. The dining table looked smaller than I remembered. My mom had set it neatly, her silverware lined up like she was expecting guests. Dinner started quietly. My dad asked about my upcoming projects, and I told him about a commercial redesign I was leading downtown. My mother nodded occasionally, her tone measured, avoiding her usual criticisms. The silence between topics wasn't tense, it was cautious. Halfway through the meal, she said softly, "You've done well." It wasn't loud enough to sound like pride, but it was real enough to be noticed. When dinner ended, I stood up to leave, and she followed me to the living room where all the new design details came together. The light fixtures reflected across the hardwood, like something out of a magazine. She stared at them for a moment and said she hadn't realized how much went into rebuilding the house until she tried handling the early insurance paperwork herself. There was no lecture behind the words, just an observation. Before I left, I handed her the binder with all the warranty details, supplier contacts, and future maintenance schedules. The same binder I gave every client. She held it like it was heavier than it was. Then she said quietly, almost like she didn't mean to let it slip, "I don't deserve this." I didn't respond. I thanked them both, walked out, and locked the professional chapter behind me. Over the next few months, my name started showing up more often. Local builders, magazines, and realtors recommended my company as the top design firm in the area. Clients mentioned hearing about me through someone's mother who always spoke about her daughter's business but never said her name. It wasn't hard to guess who that was. My dad started visiting my office occasionally. He'd bring coffee, ask about projects, and mention little things my mother was doing differently. She'd started volunteering with a local home improvement charity, helping low-income families with small interior fixes. Apparently, she used the same project binders I gave her, right down to the formatting. She never admitted where she got the idea. The quiet shift between us became noticeable in small ways. She didn't interfere anymore, didn't correct, didn't compete. If we saw each other at events, she greeted me with polite calm instead of tension. Her friends often complimented her on having such a talented daughter. She always smiled, even if it looked practiced. A few months later, on my 30th birthday, an envelope arrived at my studio. It had no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Inside was a plain card with a single line. "You were right. Opinions matter when they build something real." No name, no message, no signature. I didn't reply. I placed the card inside my office drawer, between project sketches and property contracts, and never mentioned it again. Time passed quickly after that. My firm expanded to another city. My parents' home became a quiet local landmark, the modern rebuild everyone pointed out when driving through the neighborhood. Realtors loved to mention that it was professionally restored by the homeowner's daughter. The irony seemed to hang in the air every time my mother's name came up. She never tried to reclaim credit, not anymore. When people asked her about the house, she just said her daughter handled everything. And that was the closest thing to acknowledgement I ever expected. Years later, during a home show where I was speaking as a guest designer, I noticed her in the audience. She stayed in the back row, blending in with the crowd, listening quietly as I talked about structure, light, and balance. When the session ended, she waited until everyone else had left before approaching. She didn't say anything, just nodded and placed a small folded program on the table beside me. Later, I opened it to find a note written inside. "It's beautiful. You made it all beautiful." That was the last time we ever talked about design, or the past, or anything tied to the old arguments that once filled our lives. The years that followed were simpler. Occasional visits, polite dinners, no debates. The hierarchy that once ruled every room she entered had quietly shifted without confrontation. Her world, the one she built on control and appearances, now revolved around the work of the daughter she once dismissed. And she knew it. Sometimes clients ask me what made me choose this line of work. I tell them it started with one sentence. Someone once told me that my opinions didn't matter. They always laugh lightly, thinking it's a motivational story. I let them think that, because the truth is, nothing about it was motivation, it was consequence. My mother once shaped her entire life around proving she was always right. But in the end, it wasn't words or apologies that rewrote our story. It was walls repainted, floors rebuilt, and a quiet acceptance that control doesn't last forever. The day she stopped trying to have the last word, she finally understood the weight of mine.